Good afternoon. Hello, I'm Damian Collins. I'm going to be moderating this panel. As you can see, there are 3 chairs, but only 2 people. I'm reassured that Thomas Jarzombek, the Minister, is on his way here and will be here in about 10 minutes and will join us. What we're going to try and do is try and run the session a little bit longer than was scheduled, so we should still have sort of 45 minutes or so for discussion. So hopefully no one will miss out on anything, but Thomas will enter stage left as you're looking at it and pick up the microphone and join us when he can. So just to introduce myself, I'm a former British Member of Parliament, former Minister for Tech, and I chaired the Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee of the House of Commons. And on my left is my former parliamentary colleague, but he is still in the UK Parliament, Sir Jeremy Wright. And Jeremy was the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, and also previously the Attorney General in the UK government. Now, we're sort of, I suppose, both here and both interested in being on this panel because we were both sort of heavily involved in different ways in the development of the UK's regulatory approach to big tech platforms. So the UK has the Online Safety Act, which is the UK equivalent of the DSA, and the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act, which is the UK version of the DMA, pieces of legislation that are similar but work in a slightly different way as a kind of national regime. So what I want to sort of discuss on the panel is the different approaches Europe is taking to platform regulation and why that is important, and the role that tech can also play in transforming the delivery of government. But while we're waiting for Thomas, I thought I might just start with Jeremy and just say, I mean, Jeremy, we've seen a lot of pressure from the American government through trade policy in particular to try and force European governments to back down on tech regulation. And I'd welcome sort of your perspective on that and how you think governments need to respond.
Yes, thank you, Damian. Well, good afternoon. Nice to be here. You will imagine that politicians have no trouble filling extra time, so we shall keep it going. Don't you worry. So I think the answer to the question is we know, and it's been referred to in the previous panel for those of you who were here for that this is a very unusual US presidency. We can all have our views as to whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, but it's definitely unusual. And so I think to some extent, we will have to accept that business will be done differently for the next 3 years at least. But we do also, I think, have to remember that the United States is not Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is not the United States. And there is more than one perspective in the United States about the right way to approach digital regulation. There is a congressional perspective, and there are state-level perspectives as well. So I think what we outside the United States, who are clearly affected by what the United States decides and what this president decides, have to keep in mind is that we do also need to keep the conversation going with other people in the American political and regulatory establishment about what different approaches they may seek to impress upon the president and perhaps pursue when the president is no longer there. So that's the first point. I mean, the second point is that in every country, you have to make a decision whether you are going to pursue a regulatory approach that seeks international consensus and tries to bring everybody along at the same time, or whether you're going to pursue something that's specific to your own country. And I think, obviously, the first of them is preferable if it can be achieved. But I think the view that I took, and as Damian says, I was involved with the development of the Online Safety Act in the UK at a very early stage, and we were thinking through whether it was sensible to try and produce at that point what would have been the first attempt at regulating online platforms solely in the UK, or whether we should wait until there was a more or less international consensus. We don't expect every country to sign up, obviously, but if you'd expect the countries you would expect to sign up to that consensus and wait until they're ready to do it, then of course we would have had a much more comprehensive response to what are international platforms. But we would have waited, I think, a long time for that consensus. So our view was, we're going to actually proceed, we're going to do our own thing, we're going to produce a version of online regulation which we will accept. Not everybody will sign up to every detail of, but I think the alternative would have meant stasis. And I don't think that is a responsible approach for any state to take. So in the end, this is an international problem. Of course it is. That's why we're having an international conversation over the next 2 days. But every individual nation state has a responsibility to its own people. And I think it's important for individual nation state governments to legislate where they think it's appropriate, and then to make the case for international consensus where it's possible. So yes, of course, we're going to have to respond to what happens in the United States. These are largely American platforms we're talking about. And the American administration is hugely important in what it thinks about that. But in the end, I think national politicians have to make national decisions, and then we have to argue about how we sync together all of our different national approaches on online regulation.
I mean, in some ways, the thing that the different approaches to regulation have in common, and that make them very different from the United States, is that there's some sort of principle of responsibility and liability that rests on the platforms. And of course, in America, there is a explicit carve-out of liability for tech platforms that it was instituted there really in a world before social media existed, and is still defended by the tech companies there, but in Europe is different. And I think at the heart of it is that establishment of some kind of platform liability for what happens on the platforms they've built and they profit from, but they have some responsibility for user safety and to prevent illegal activity.
Yes, and I think, Section 230, isn't it, the Communications Act that you're talking about, some people here will be very familiar with, is exactly designed to prevent us seeing, or in the United States, platforms being seen as publishers and giving them accountability in the same way as newspaper editors would have for what's published in a newspaper. But for me, that's not the right analogy anyway. These are not newspapers. I think the more interesting analogy, and the analogy we pursued in the UK with the Online Safety Act, is a duty of care model really based on a health and safety at work piece of legislation dating back to the 1970s, which essentially says, and every country here represented will have something similar on its statute books, that if you run a shop or a restaurant and you admit the public to your premises, you have a responsibility to keep them reasonably safe in those premises. You don't leave the floors soaking wet. You don't leave things for them to trip over. Those are your basic obligations as somebody who runs a facility to which the public have access. I think this is a really good analogy, actually, for the digital space. We should be saying to those who run digital platforms, you have a responsibility to keep the people who access your space as safe as you reasonably can. Now, I will say, and I speak as a lawyer here as well as a politician, the word reasonably is really important. It's very important that we recognize that not every piece of bad content reaching any vulnerable user is a consequence of the platform not doing its job properly. There are some things it's not reasonable to expect a platform to prevent. And although in the UK the word reasonably has been translated into the word proportionately, and we could spend the next 47 minutes discussing whether there's any real difference between those two words, but the principle's the same. And it is, you have a basic obligation to keep your users as safe as you sensibly can. But if you don't do that, you will find that there is regulatory intervention, and you will find that there are sanctions. And if you have that kind of conversation, you set that kind of framework, you really don't need to get into the question of whether a platform is a publisher or not. It's a different kind of entity with a different kind of set of responsibilities.
I think you've thrown out a tantalizing sidebar there of a kind of lawyers-only political tech summit, which could...
Yeah, but that I'm going to have to charge, though.
Now, do you think as well, I think there's debate around digital regulation is often presented, I think, by people like Donald Trump, some people in the media, as this is a kind of high-level debate between politicians, regulators, people in their ivory tower trying to control things. without recognizing that actually the reason we got to the place we're in, and the fact that there is regulation in Europe and in the UK and in countries like Australia. We have Zoe McKenzie from the Australian House of Commons, who's sitting in the front row here, who'll be speaking tomorrow. There are other countries around the world looking to take similar approaches, is because actually the public support it. You know, and I think we saw recently the reaction to the creation of intimate images on Grok, and the public outrage at that was not just about regulators overreaching. It was genuine public reaction that says, this is wrong and the platform shouldn't be able to get away with this.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you know this, I know this, Zoe knows this, anyone else who's an active politician in the room, and many of you who are connected to politics know this, the public are not always reasonable in their expectations, but they quite often have expectations of their politicians, and they do expect that politicians will act to keep the public safe. That's what they think our job is, and they are right. That is our job. And so simply saying to ourselves, this is all very difficult, perhaps because these are international platforms, perhaps because it's incredibly technically complex, saying to ourselves, well, there's nothing really we can do, we'll just have to leave the situation as it is, I don't think is an acceptable political response. And you're right, I think President Trump sees this purely through the lens of freedom of speech. And he says to himself, I don't want to see any restrictions on freedom of speech. To which I think our response collectively can be, all right, let's have a conversation about freedom of speech. And there are two things to say. The first is, we have never, in any other environment, print media, broadcast media, out there on the street, had an unrestricted freedom of speech. We have always said as a society, there are limits on your freedom of speech. And generally speaking, those limits are about impositions on the freedom of others. And therefore, rights issues are generally a question of balance. So is this. So if you want to frame this purely about freedom of speech, by all means, but recognize it's not just one person's freedom of speech we are talking about. And we have always said, the criminal law and other laws can limit your freedom of speech for the benefit of everybody else. And the second point is, because this isn't just about one person's freedom of speech, if you have unrestricted freedom of speech, are we really arguing that means you have the right to harass, bully, and intimidate other people off the platforms altogether? Because we know that's what's happening. And if that's what's happening, that is an imposition on freedom of speech. The people who are pro-freedom of speech are the people who are pro-everybody's freedom of speech. And that, I'm afraid, means we need a regulated environment. And I don't think that regulation, therefore, is anti-freedom of speech. I think it's pro-freedom of speech. There are lots of other things wrong with President Trump's argument, by the way, but we've only got till 3:30. So let's focus just on the freedom of speech point. But even there, the counter-arguments are stronger, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we were having this conference, this discussion 5 years ago, we might have been discussing, well, is it possible to do? You know, should these be self-regulatory systems for the platforms? The idea now of stepping back, you know, would be, I think, politically unthinkable. There may be some populist parties that want to do that for different and complex reasons, but I think there's genuine consensus that it should be there, and that protecting, you know, child safety online, combating frauds and scams, and enforcing the laws that we've had for years on, you know, inciting racial hatred. I mean, Germany has very particular laws on hate speech as well that are different from the rest of Europe. Yeah. And I don't think anyone would, you know, apart from extremists, sort of advocate scrapping those regulations and making the internet more of a free-for-all than it already is.
Yeah, completely right. And I think people do instinctively recognize that in other areas of their lives, there are regulatory constraints which are designed to protect us all corporately as a society, and they would expect that to be online. I also think that once you've colonized this territory to some degree, and to be frank, you know, this isn't entirely accidental, what we have done, what the EU have done, what Australia has done, is start with the easiest territory there is, which is the protection of our children. Almost everybody will agree it is sensible to protect our children from material online that will harm them. So if you start there and you establish the principle that, contrary to what some in this space have been arguing, it is possible to regulate the internet, and it is possible to regulate online spaces without utterly destroying the concept of freedom of speech. If you demonstrate that in that context, you can start to apply it to others. Now, this fills some people with complete terror, of course, and they say, well, I knew it. This is a slippery slope. You're eventually going to stop me saying what I want. But there are areas we can productively discuss around misinformation and disinformation as a good example, where the truth is we have reached the point where asking the public largely to do this themselves and to determine for themselves whether what they're looking at is genuine or not is now unlikely to be effective. We can't expect people to do that. There has to be some assistance. And I think we may get onto this, but I think we need to talk about the ways in which we can give people the tools they require to deal with misinformation and disinformation online, because there isn't just a societal obligation for governments here, there's a national security obligation as well, given where much of this disinformation in particular is coming from.
Exactly. So there's a kind of, if you like, election integrity, democratic integrity, user safety. Those are all, I think, often front of mind, more emotive, more directly felt. I think the competition piece of that is important as well, because if we talk about the need to build up the European tech stack, that is difficult to do if American gatekeeper businesses are sort of undercutting the market for new entrants through self-preferencing and price gouging and other things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we all talk about innovation in this space, and we all recognize the need for a continuous churn of innovative development. But you're not going to get that if we don't get the competition atmosphere correct. We're not going to create the innovators that we need to come up with the new devices and approaches that we require to deal with some of these big online problems if we don't get the competition right. And again, I will confess to you, I'm not a technologist. I don't necessarily understand the technical details of how these platforms work. But I have always been entirely unpersuaded by the argument of internet exceptionalism that says there's something about this sacred space online that is wholly different to everything else we in humanity have ever tried to do as legislators and regulators. I think it's complete nonsense. Yes, of course, the atmosphere is different and the entities are different, but the principles are the same. And the principles are about governments taking responsibility for legislating where they have to in order to protect our society's equities. That's what governments are for. That's why those of us who have been in government or are in government are in it. Otherwise, you wouldn't need any of this. Don't be tempted to think that might be the case. There is, in fact, a need. We do need to do that. And so governments have to work out how you apply the standard principles that we've applied to almost every other industry in our civilized history to this one. Not straightforward, but I do not accept it's impossible.
So I was going to ask you both this question, but I'll ask you this question first to you, and then if you answer it before Thomas gets here, we can see if he answers it differently. Now, there's a lot of interest in... here he is. Perfect timing. Very good to see you, Thomas.
Thanks, also from my side, and obviously it started before, but so we were appointed at 3 p.m. I asked everyone in my team, and they were absolutely convinced that it's 3 p.m., so sorry about whatever might be the reason for that. I try always to be very much on point.
Well, you were on point for 3 o'clock, absolutely. So we've got
Yes.
we're going to run the session a little bit longer than we'd originally planned, so if you have time, we'll probably go to about 3:30. So Jeremy and I have just been chatting, but I thought where I might start off is there's been a lot of focus in the conference at Davos recently, and in the position the American government is taking on a range of issues, security issues, technology issues, and so on. Do you feel, as a minister in the German government, an EU politician, that Europe can afford to rely on America in the way we have done before? And in terms of technology, can we afford to rely on American tech? or do we need to build up options and resilience within you? I would say, as you're on the panel with us, I'd say within the continent of Europe as well as the EU.
Yeah, so obviously we are in a period of time where nobody really can rely on anybody else. So that's how it seems to be right now. And that's not only a question about the relationship to our American friends, also maybe a question inside of Europe. And as you can see that the political landscape is changing so rapidly, and these far-right parties bringing completely different approach when it comes to democracy values. And so that's the reason why I think everybody must see where he can invest in more resilience. And when it comes to the IT sector and to questions of software and everything else. So I just can say for myself, I cleared my OneDrive over the Christmas holidays, because after the event on the Christmas Eve, I wasn't so sure that I can access every time I want to if some developments would continue. And I think a lot of people in Germany are pretty concerned about what happened to Thierry Breton. I don't like him, to make that clear. So we had so many different positions when it came to space, and I think what he did in a lot of political issues was a disaster. But nevertheless, that's no reason to say you're not allowed to get into our country anymore, as he was an elected official. And also it's the same thing so with the two persons from Hate Aid. And therefore, so we are right now, as I already said, in a period of time where we have to build more resilience for ourselves.
And I mean, the other thing I think was interesting at Davos was the speech given by the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, which has attracted quite a lot of interest. And I think one of the challenges it throws down for the EU, Canada, the UK, Australia probably, is, despite our various differences and different interests, is, should we be looking for more opportunities to work together when we can and do so in a constructive way, particularly in the tech space where, one block trying to compete with America and China directly is hard, but there are lots of areas where working together could make that task easier for us.
Yes, absolutely, and I think so. If and all the bad things of this Ukraine war, the good thing is that also with our British friends we come closer together in this E3 format, and I think I can say it. So the Brits are missing in the EU very much. That's what we were afraid of when Brexit happened, and so it's also realized in the same way. And yes, I think we need to cooperate more with countries where we think we share the same democratic values in core. And I think this is the landscape how it looks like today. Are you a liberal democracy, or are you going to a more totalitarianism system? And but in the end, so if I look at Germany, so what I can say is that we have a very strong relationship to the United States over all these decades. Many people in Germany think that Americans are their friends, and that's a long history starting after World War II and how American soldiers here behaved. That was very positive. There are very many people who have positive memories on that, and so America brought us freedom and democracy, and also the economy system, and this is maybe also the reason why market share of American companies when it comes to IT is very large here. If you look at Google, it has a market share bigger than in other European countries, Microsoft for other services. So we are really, really open on American products, and the first problem is that in the end, we always believed it's the other way around in the same way, but as we see tariffs against our car manufacturers, etc., we see that it's not in the same way as it used to be. And so right now, what we are debating about is so what can we learn out of that, and how can we create an own IT ecosystem and focus more on software, because Germany is a country that focuses very much on hardware. We have we're very strong in hardware, and so when you go to the schools, everything is trained to create physicists and not software engineers. And over the whole cycle, you can see that the space and aviation engineer is the best known job you can do. And if you're building software with some bugs and alpha and beta releases, so this is not the first thing here. in the past. But right now, I think we see a lot of software startups, a lot of software businesses starting, and we want to push that. Nevertheless, what happens in the rest of the world, we want to participate more, also in the wealth that's coming out of that. And we see that what you can earn from a machine that switches from hardware. In former times, it was all hardware, and now it's the most is services and data.
I mean, there's been a lot of pressure from the Trump administration on European regulation of technology. Pushback against the DSA and the DMA, similar sort of pushback against UK regulation, and a challenge obviously to the EU over the AI Act. What do you think the way forward is with that, particularly with the AI Act? Do you think there is scope for reform and change there, or do you think that the EU and EU governments will want to see a rigorous enforcement of that?
The first thing is that Donald Trump must congratulate us on the AI Act because it helps the American companies. It makes things so complicated that it's very hard to get compliant for smaller and medium enterprises and for startups. And it's big. The whole European digital regulation is a nightmare for a small company, and it's a big advantage for large entities with large legal departments. So let's say this as a very general look on the whole thing. And I'm not sure if the AI Act really focuses the real problems when it comes to AI. And it's the same with the DSA. I think when we started about regulation of social media, in the beginning it was that all these companies, they didn't have any kind of subsidiary in Germany. And if you had a problem with them, there was no opportunity to go to a court and to make a process against them. So, and when we had to start to say, okay, I don't know the English word for that, eine ladungsfähige Anschrift. You needed an address, a person in Germany you could address to file a suit against these companies. And so a regulation is absolutely necessary, but what we see in DSA is that it has some really strong advantages, but it also has some things that AfD and other right-wing parties are using, or extreme right parties are using to say, so we have censorship. There is no censorship at anything, and it's not intended to have any kind of censorship. And so we must build an update of DSA to make stronger, to make the real important things stronger, and to mitigate these parts of this regulation that seem to make or that deliver arguments for censorship. And to stress one thing, DMA is absolutely key. So DMA is a different thing because unfair competition is not good for no economy. And so fair competition is everything. And so as I'm a kind of veteran from the IT business, so unfair competition is a thing that we know from companies in the IT business since 1980s. Yeah. The per processor license.
We were just talking about this actually when you arrived, that in some ways there's often more focus on disinformation, online safety, because threats to democracy, because those are obviously very front of mind. But without effective competition regulation, we can't see European businesses succeed against the American gatekeepers.
Yeah, and also it's a problem for innovation in itself, because when Microsoft bundled the Internet Explorer with Microsoft Windows some days ago, it was a period of 5 years with not a single update for Internet Explorer. Cannot imagine. I didn't believe it when I heard it the first time, and just Google this. You can find really 5 years without any update. And so that happens when you don't have fair competition. So it's monopolists are the enemies of innovation.
I mean, Jeremy, just to ask the question I asked Thomas as well. I mean, I keep hearing the word Brexit keeps popping up during this summit, I've noticed. But so, from the perspective of the UK, I mean, what do you think role the UK should be playing in working with the EU and with countries like Australia and Canada in trying to build sort of resilience where we can create options rather than just having to rely on American tech and regulation?
Yeah, well, I think there is huge potential for cooperation, and I think whatever your views of Brexit, you can see it as a decision that was taken around a specific set of economic associations. There are two areas where we have been discussing in this conference already, and we'll doubtless discuss further, where the level of cooperation is just going to have to go up because of the backdrop presented by the Trump White House. One is defense and security, where I don't think there is any reason to believe that the UK would not wish to have a closer defense association with its other NATO allies if it cannot rely on support from the United States. That's a logical position for the UK to take. That has nothing to do with Brexit. And in relation to the specific conversation we're having here, the level of intervention by politicians and regulators in online spaces is starting to find some synergies. So there are differences, of course there are, between the Online Safety Act and the Digital Services Act. And there are differences in the UK's approach to the Australian approach, for example. But there are also huge overlaps, huge similarities. And that isn't surprising because we're all dealing with the same challenges. And I think the balance that all these countries tend to find between individual freedoms and collective securities is much more homogeneous than the position taken between all of those countries and the United States in those balances. So it isn't surprising to me that we can find common ground in these areas, and we are now going to have to. And we will need to do it because we'll need to be a counterweight to whatever is or is not being done, certainly at federal level in the United States.
I mean, we've got a bit of time left, so one sort of topic area I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on because, I mean, Thomas, your government responsibilities include sort of transformation of government, modernisation of government. I think most people would see technology and AI as being something that could have a big impact on the way government services are delivered. But at the same time, sort of citizens need to trust the way those technologies are going to be deployed. One of that, if you like, the consequences of some of the problems we've been discussing is there's not always that level of trust there. I mean, how do you see that within the German state? Obviously, you have different sort of government structure to the UK, and which is more centralised. But how do you see this working in Germany?
I think trust is not our main problem. Our main problem is, as you correctly described, that we have a very fragmented landscape and we have more of 400 municipal units, Landkreise, and below of them there are furthermore municipal units, and so it's a very fragmented landscape. And it was an advantage in former times. So this is not being created as a mistake. It was created in a time where you didn't have any connectivity, and so it was smarter to process things locally and not always to deliver this just first to Bonn or to Berlin. But right now in this digital era, it's a disadvantage because everybody created their own solutions and they're pretty complicated and they don't have APIs and they're not connected, and so this is the core problem that we are facing. And so what we're trying to do right now are two things. One mission is that we go to the whole legacy ecosystem and pretty simple, we give them money for implementing APIs to their old legacy software. And the other track is to go there with startups, especially with AI startups. And so we call this Rebuild Germany. We want to rebuild all this old stuff with new high-tech software created by AI. And I think in the last 3 months, AI development had drastically changed, and now it's pretty simple to recreate all these applications completely new. Also to create applications without dependencies on Microsoft Word and things that we had, because you can build an editor also with your AI tools, and you don't need Word anymore. And that's what we're doing. We are doing these two tracks with these AI startups. We are challenging the old players, and we go on the other side on the old players. But to be honest, nobody is really aware of what AI will change in the next years, and I think it will be drastic. And I meet people, some say, so, okay, AI didn't change the labor market until today. And on the other side, I meet people from the AI business, they say, what do you do when in 3 years 80% of all office jobs are gone? And so this is what we're discussing right now internally. And I think, how would the process look like to say 80% of the jobs are gone? Because you have Gewerkschaften and Mitbestimmung and all this stuff here in Germany. And not everybody will change their insurance because another one is 3% cheaper. And so, these are the models that we are just discussing and thinking about. And also, what does it mean for us, for processing our own business?
Yeah. I mean, Jeremy, what's your view on this from a UK perspective?
Yeah, so I want to pick up first on the point Thomas makes about coordination. And I think there is huge potential for artificial intelligence to develop better coordination within government. There's no doubt about that, and there's huge need for it, both in the UK system, German system, lots of other systems too. But my experience as a community representative, as much as a minister, is that the people I've represented over 20 years have an entirely conflicted view, actually, about government's possession of their data. So they are nervous because they don't trust politicians. But they also have a much higher expectation than you might imagine that the government does coordinate their data and shares it around different parts of government, such that they are immensely frustrated when, having told one part of government their information, they have to repeat it to another part of government, and they say routinely to me, they may say it to you, why don't these two bits of government talk to each other? Why don't this bit tell that bit so that I don't have to tell that bit? So there is a huge conflict, I think, in the public's understanding of what degrees of coordination are possible, desirable, and are already there. But the second thing is that the real challenge I think we have to confront on artificial intelligence within the processes of government is the degree to which AI is taking decisions that affect citizens of our respective countries. And if that is to be the case, who is to be held accountable for that decision-making process? And because, as rightly there should not be, there isn't absolute trust of the political system, people will want to know that if a decision is taken about me that I disagree with, I have the capacity to challenge that decision. And if the decision is being taken by AI somewhere in the system, that is very difficult for a citizen to do. So what we're going to have to do, I think, in order to deploy all of this AI capability, which I completely agree we will need to do, is to reconcile this issue of human accountability for AI decision-making, so that where the citizen wishes to challenge the decision, there is a recognizable and effective way to do so. And we have not got that right yet.
I mean, Thomas, do you think, I think at the heart of this is really the idea that there's some liability and accountability for the use of AI, that someone can't build an AI system that breaks the law and their defense can't be, well, it wasn't me who did it, it was the AI. And so you've got to have, there's got to, and in some ways, if anything, maybe the AI Act has tried to be too prescriptive and tried to anticipate too many different outcomes, but actually, if we were to keep it simple, it would simply be that, build what you want, develop what you want, but understand that you're going to be responsible in some way for how these tools are used.
I think this is a theoretical problem right now, because so what are we talking about? If you have simple, most processes that we see are pretty simple, and therefore you just need APIs and you need a process management behind that, and there is no AI in this kind of processes. So, and what we are building right now, and it's almost ready, we're testing the solution in two of our Länder. Right now in Hamburg and in North Rhine-Westphalia is a platform for approval for large infrastructure projects. And right now these are processes that take for some time, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years to build a new railroad or a new Autobahn.
We can relate to that.
Yeah, and you have a lot of compliance from citizens, and in some ways we have 100,000 of that. And so what does this AI system do? In the beginning, you have a large number of documents, and it checks if they are complete, if there are any disparities. The second thing is all the management of these complaints from the citizens. It takes their address, it cumulates them and says, so we have 5,000 of this and 8,000 of this, and so, and then there are political decisions to say, okay, we accept this 8,000 and maybe they're right or they're not right, and in the end the system delivers to these 100,000 people the answer of that. And in the end, it creates a document of 200, 300 pages, Planfeststellungsbeschluss as we call it here. But all these documents that are created, they are always finalized by human lawyers. And it's not possible to do it different because of liability, but also because it's such a complex thing. And you need a human in the loop. The system is not good enough, even if it's pretty good. And we invested 100 million euros in this project. It's not a small project, yeah? But in the end, you need very specialized lawyers who get over this. And so we don't have a problem with liability or transparency or anything like this. We speed up the simple things. That's what we're doing with this AI process.
Yeah. Well,
Can I just add slightly and ever so slightly and respectfully disagree? So I'm delighted, by the way, to hear that we're still retaining lawyers in the process. This is good news for my former profession. But the scenario that I have in mind, I suppose, is in social security, for an example. So I suspect we are already some way towards this, but we will certainly get there, where decisions about whether a particular individual should or should not be in receipt of a particular disability benefit, for example, will be taken by AI, because the factors to be taken into account can be laid out. The machine learning can decide whether it finds that case persuasive or unpersuasive and say, yes, you get the benefit, no, you don't. That is something of profound interest to the individual who will or will not be receiving the benefit. They may disagree if they're declined as an applicant for that benefit. They want to know how they can challenge that decision. So we will need to decide whether what we're going to do is we're going to set the AI to make the initial decision, then use a human to decide appeals, or what we're going to do. Now, I think it's perfectly feasible. We can work this out, but we are going to have to do it. Because if you want the feasibility benefits, the efficiency benefits of AI, you're going to ask it to do more. And if you ask it to do more, sooner or later you run up against that citizen disagreement with the conclusions it's reached.
Yeah, but in the end, I believe, so the first thing is that in all this social legislation, the thresholds are pretty sharp. So this is one thing. But the other thing is that what AI can do is to aggregate complex documents and to prepare a decision by a human being. And so in the end that you can see on a single side, so this is the situation, and this is possibility A, and this is possibility B, and the system might suggest better to take A, but maybe there are some reasons that the person decides to go for B. But in the end, the decision is always made by the human being. But the process of aggregating all these documents and to preparing this decision, this is what takes a long time.
But I think part of the problem is, I can certainly speak to our experience in the UK. I'd imagine from what you said, Germany is similar, is that often for the citizen, these systems are incredibly complicated. You know, there are lots of different benefits, the visa applications, lots of different forms. And one of the reasons people get slow decisions is that there's a mistake that an AI could spot very quickly and help them correct, rather than waiting months for them to be told they filled the format wrong.
So AI maybe is the only chance to get over all this bureaucracy. So what we are doing is also, again, two ways. The one way is we try to fight against the bureaucracy. So that's the job, especially my colleague Philip Amthor is doing. And the other track is to say, okay, if we cannot fight everything of this bureaucracy, and we have so complex forms, and so complex regulations, and then we need AI to make it simple, to have a simple user interface and to make it easy also for people who are not lawyers to get access to all these.
Are there such people? Surely not.
Now, it's about 20 past, so we can probably sort of string it out for another few minutes, I think, before the next panel needs to come on. I wasn't briefed whether I was allowed to do this, but I might just do it anyway. We've got a very attentive audience of people, and there may be some people in the room who have a burning question they'd like to put to the panel. If there is, please indicate. If not, we will fill the time. Yes.
We are politicians, so we're not going to answer the questions. Just to be aware.
Well, I will come. You can use. We've got like TV studio mode now. You can use my mic.
Thank you very much. My question goes out to Damian and Jeremy. So I think in Europe, they were finally realizing the importance of open source technologies in terms of accelerating innovation and sort of getting this sovereignty that Europe is aiming for. I was curious to understand what is the approach or sort of the thought around open source in the policies and regulations there, especially, Jeremy, you mentioned how regulating big tech in order to increase competition, but how can regulation help open source businesses? I think 2 weeks ago as well, the Commission came out with a paper talking about finally recognizing the need to support commercialized open source. Yeah.
You want me to start on that? So I think open source has a huge part to play in this, and one of the challenges I think for politicians and for regulators is to seek to regulate intelligently in areas they don't very well understand. But again, to be honest, this is not a new challenge. Politicians, I hate to break this to you all, rarely understand the area they're regulating in. And their trick is to be able to listen to those who do and then regulate intelligently in response. So open source is one of those areas where we can think intelligently about how to use these devices to create the competition outcomes that we wish to see and the innovation outcomes that we wish to see. But one other thing maybe to add, and that is that this dichotomy that's often put up between innovation on the one hand and regulation on the other is a false dichotomy. And that's because if you are an innovator, particularly if you're a smaller company without, as Thomas was saying earlier, without the huge capacity to learn what the regulations are, huge legal teams to work through them and decide what they really mean, that can be a huge restriction on your capacity to think innovatively and to take risks. And what you will probably do is you will say, well, I don't really know whether the regulation allows me to do this or that, so I won't just in case. Or I might expect that the regulatory landscape will change so that I'm starting my innovation now, but by the time I launch it on the market, the regulation will say it can't be done that way. So clarity in regulation is essential for everybody, but particularly beneficial to the smaller players in the market. And the clearer we can be about the parameters that we set in regulation, the better it is for the real innovators in the marketplace.
I mean, very, very briefly, from my point of view, I do think the debate on open source has shifted. I think when the UK hosted the first AI summit, was then called the AI Safety Summit, there was I think a more reflected concern that open source could be very dangerous, these technologies could be very powerful, they could fall into the wrong hands. I think to a shift now that Chinese developments in AI are such that you can't keep this as a closed piece of intelligence for 3 or 4 companies, with all the world's data in their buckets. Actually, we need open source to allow other people to develop and utilize these tools. I think maybe Thomas, maybe you could say something on your point on software on this. This could be a way where AI can help, AI and open source helps Europe close the gap with the Americans a little bit, because the use of code, the development of new technologies could be a lot easier with open source technologies.
I think you need to be pragmatic in the end, because when we look at the landscape, we see open source pretty strong for all the components that are below the surface. Yeah? Linux servers are the most used servers on the internet. You see Docker, Kubernetes, all this stuff. So there is open source very strong. When it comes to the desktop and to the user interface, open source is very weak. And maybe it's because you need a consensus there, and for some decisions, consensus is also a problem, because you cannot move forward as fast as other companies do. We see it completely pragmatic. We have an open source approach. We invest with the Sovereign Tech Agency a more than 10 million, so more than 10 million each year in the open source ecosystem. We have with CENDIS a unit to implement open source in the government. So that's what we're doing. On the other side, we are trying to procure more and more from startups, also SAS from startups, and so we are pragmatic on that.
Yeah, I think we've probably got time for one more question, I think.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this talk. It's very interesting. So you have mentioned digital platforms and EU resilience, right? And it's a topic on which many organizations and members of the European Parliament have asked for European alternatives for US tech platforms that are very well used in Europe, but that you can't really regulate that much upon. So of course, we all, I think, who want more European alternatives about it. But the real question for me that I would want to ask you is, how can we convince the European people, the citizens of all the countries, to consume more of these alternatives? So to shift from these US platforms that they're all used to consume towards European alternatives.
Thomas, do you want to start?
So the first thing is to start by ourselves. And so that's what I'm doing on my personal desktop. I'm working with LibreOffice. I think this is a really good solution. I like it more than Microsoft Office, to make a statement here also for open source. Yeah, first thing. And that's also for the government. So when we use cloud services, for instance, we are going right out and we try to make the procurement with European cloud companies. And we have pretty strong ones here: Schwarz Digits, Stackit, Ionos, Telecom, and others. And we also need to convince the corporates that it's also necessary for them to have a plan B. Because you have seen in the automotive industry, if you depend on a single source with these chips from this Chinese company, sooner or later you get a problem. And it must not be a political problem, it can also be a technical problem, a fab that's burning or things like that. Nobody's perfect. And therefore, we're talking very much to the corporates and say you need a plan B, and also try to start with these European platforms and look what you can achieve with them, and maybe just to start with all this. And so it can be a bigger movement, I believe. And we're building this gigafactory for AI. That's a further thing right now. But I think it's a process that's not overnight. There is not a single solution. That's you have to convince a lot of people.
I mean, probably the most critical aspect of that is probably cloud computing, isn't it? That's the one piece of infrastructure where obviously Google and Amazon have particularly big market share, which, so much of the European economy runs on those platforms and systems. Do you think we can build sort of European resilience in cloud?
I think there was a period where we were stronger and we got weaker and weaker, and the market share of the US players raised and raised. But right now I see there is much more movement right now here. And I think also Schwarz is bringing a lot of dynamic in this market, and that's good. In the end, it's not that complex. But all these US cloud providers, they benefited from their strong consumer market position. And for a long time in the European IT industry, it was told, okay, the first part of the game was the consumer, and so this is the American thing, they know how customers do, and so we are strong on the business side. And the second half will be the business internet, and then we go forward. And everybody realized then that with the infrastructures that were created for this consumer internet, these companies are so strong that you cannot beat them anymore in the business internet. That's what happened. And I think if you buy 1 million servers and you think what can you do, how can you bring traffic to these servers, it's a perfect thing if there is business on daytime and gaming and entertaining and Netflix and all this on the nighttime, and maybe after midnight you build AI models, and so you can achieve 100% usage of these processes, and that's the thing what you have to do.
Jeremy, what's your...
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is we can't just say to our citizens, it is your patriotic duty to talk to your friends on a European platform instead of an American one. In truth, if we want people to use alternative platforms, those platforms have to be good. They have to be a good consumer offer for people to transfer. That's the first thing to say. And then if you ask yourself, how do we give ourselves the best chance that a competitor platform will be attractive to the consumer, you have to think about skills, you have to think about the environment that you create for developers and innovators to base themselves in European countries to develop their product and to keep them as European products. And you have to deal with the biggest problem of all, which is that a British or a German innovator who comes up with a fantastic platform idea and develops it to a certain level will be offered a life-changing amount of money by an American platform to take it off their hands. And we have to find a way of offering them something that's just as good as that in order to keep them developing it within a European or a British channel. But the last thing to say, I think, is that even if we were to succeed in transferring all of the citizens of Europe off American platforms onto European ones, we would still have a regulatory problem to address, because a European platform is not automatically, I'm afraid, going to be better behaved than an American one. We might like to think so, but I think there will still be a requirement to say the worst excesses of those platforms and making them focus on the duties we talked about earlier on is still going to be a requirement. So we can't distract ourselves entirely, I think, from the regulatory challenge by confronting the competition challenge of making sure that there are alternative players in the market. We've got to do both of those things.
Yeah, I think I think Europeans have shown from interbank lending rates to emissions rates, we're good at getting things wrong ourselves as well. But thank you very much, Jeremy and Thomas. Thank you for joining us for this panel. It's been a great discussion. Thank you for allowing us to run over a little bit. So we've had plenty of time. I can see the next panel eagerly poised in the corner, waiting to take our spaces on the stage. So thank you very much.